Hello, Junior Squirrels. GrannyDee here on Sunday, September 15th, I think. Hope you all are doing well. And Granny today is going to read. Oh my goodness, it's so long. We'll see how much I can read. It's called, I might have to take 2 times. The Princess on the Glass Hill. And now I've forgotten who told me, but Bum Clock, remember in our last story, is a beetle, a Scottish, name of a Scottish, or came from Scotland, beetle. So it must maybe look like he's got a clock on his bum. I don't know. The Princess on the Glass Hill. Once upon a time, there was a man who had a meadow which lay high up on the hillside, and in the meadow was a barn, which he had built to keep his hay in. Now, I must tell you, there hadn't been much in the barn for the last year or two, for every St. John's night, when the grass stood greenest and deepest, the meadow was eaten down to the very ground, and the next morning, just as if a whole drove of sheep had been there feeding on it overnight. This happened once, and it happened twice. So at last the man grew weary of losing his crop of hay, and said to his sons, for he had 3 of them, that now one of them must go and sleep in the barn in the outlying field. Oh my goodness, didn't put on my story reading, and I'm sitting on it. Sorry about that. I have it in the chair, then I forget about it. Then I sit on it sometimes. All right. Go sleep in the barn in the outlying field when St. John's night came, for it was too good a joke that his grass should be eaten root and blade. It wasn't a joke at all, was it? This year, as it had been the last 2 years. So whichever of them went must keep a sharp lookout, for that is what their father said. Well, the eldest son was ready to go and watch the meadow. Trust him for looking after the grass. It shouldn't be his fault if man or a beast ate a blade of it. So when evening came, he set off to the barn and lay down to sleep. How's he going to watch if he's sleeping? He had been asleep only a short time when he was awakened by a frightful clatter. The earth quaked, and the walls and roof shook and groaned and creaked. Then up jumped the lad and took to his heels as fast as ever he could, and he never looked around until he reached home. As for the hay, why, it was eaten up this year, just as it had been twice before. The next St. John's night, the man said again it would never do to lose all the grass in the outlying field year after year in this way, and one of his sons must watch it, and watch it well, too. Well, the second son thought he would try his luck, so he set off and lay down to sleep in the barn, as his brother had done the year before. As the night wore on, there came a rumbling and quaking of the earth, worse than on the last St. John's night. When the lad heard it, he was so frightened he took to his heels as though he were running a race. They're not much good looking after that, are they? Next year, the turn came to Boots. Remember him from the other story? The youngest brother, and when he made ready to go, the other 2 began to laugh and make game of him, saying, "You're just the man to watch the hay. You've done nothing. You who have done nothing all your life but sit by the ashes and toast yourself before the fire." But Boots did not care a pin for their chattering, and tramped away to the outlying field. There he went inside the barn, and guess what? Lay down. In about an hour's time, the barn began to groan and creak, so that it was dreadful to hear. "Well," said Boots to himself, "if it isn't any worse than this, I can stand it well enough." A little while after came a crash and an earthquake. "Oh," said Boots to himself, If it isn't any worse than this, I dare say I can stand it. But just then a third rumbling and a third earthquake, so that the lad thought walls and roof were coming down on his head. But it passed away, and all about him was still as could be. Don't you think he'd go look? It will come again, thought Boots, but no. Still it was, and still it stayed. But after a little while, he heard a noise as if a horse were standing just outside the barn door, cropping the grass. He crept to the door and peeped through the crack, and there stood a horse, feeding away. So big and grand a horse Boots had never set eyes on. By his side on the grass lay a saddle and bridle and a full set of armor for a knight, all of brass, so bright that the light gleamed from it. Ho, ho, thought the lad. It's you, is it, that eats up our hay? I'll soon put an end to this, see if I don't. He lost no time, but took the steel out of his tinder box and threw it over the horse. But then it was not able to stir from the spot, and became so tame that the lad could do what he liked with it. Then he got on its back and rode off with it to a place which no one knew but himself, and there he put up the horse. When he reached home, his brothers laughed and asked how he fared. Well, said Boots, all I can say is that I saw nothing that frightened me. I can't think what there was in the barn to make you both run off. A pretty story, said his brothers, but we'll soon see how you have watched the meadow. So off they set, but when they reached it, there stood the grass as deep and thick as it had been the night before. Well, the next St. John's Eve, it was the same story over again. Neither of the older boys dared to go out to the outlying field to watch the grass, but Boots went, and everything happened just as it did the year before. First a clatter and an earthquake, and then a greater clatter and another earthquake, and so on a third time, only this year the earthquakes were far worse than the year before. Then suddenly everything was still again, and the lad heard something cropping the grass outside the barn door. He stole to the door and peeped through the crack, and what do you think he saw? Why, another horse standing right out in the meadow, chewing and champing with might and main. It was far finer in every way than the horse which came the year before. It had a saddle on its back, and a bridle on its neck, and a full suit of mail. That's like chain mail, like a knight would wear. For a knight lay by its side, all of silver and as grand as you could wish to see. Ho, ho, said Boots to himself. It's you that gobbles up our hay, is it? I'll soon put an end to this. And what with that, he took the steel out of the tinder box and threw it over the horse's head, and there it stood, as still as a lamb. Well, the lad rode the horse to the hiding place where he kept the other one, and after that, he went home, and I guess he's feeding those horses wherever he's putting them. Went home. I suppose you'll tell us, said one of his brothers, there's a fine crop this year, too, up in the hayfield. Well, so there is, said Boots. And off ran the others to see, and there stood the grass, thick and deep, as it was the year before. But they scolded Boots just the same. Now, when the third St. John's Eve came, the two elder boys still hadn't the heart to go out in the barn and watch the grass. But Boots went as before, and to make a long story short, the very same thing happened this time that happened twice before. 3 earthquakes came, one after another, each worse than the one before, and when the last came, the lad danced about from the shock, and after that everything was still. Then he heard something tugging away at the grass outside the barn, so over he went quietly to the crack of the door and peeped out. There stood a horse far bigger and better than the 2 he had taken before. This time there was, besides the saddle and bridle, the most beautiful gold armor in the world. It had been silver before. Ho, ho, said the lad to himself. It's you, is it, that comes here eating up our hay? I'll soon stop that. So he caught up his steel, threw it over the horse's neck, and in a trice It stood as if it were nailed to the ground, and Boots could do as he pleased with it. Then he rode off with it to the hiding place where he kept the other two, and then went home. When he reached his home, his two brothers made game of him as they had done before. But Boots gave no heed to them, but only asked them to go and see for themselves. And when they went, there stood the grass as fine and as deep as this time as it had been twice before. Now, you must know that the king of the country where Boots lived had a daughter, of course, whom he would only give to the man who could ride over the hill of glass, as smooth and slippery as ice, close by the king's palace. Upon the tip-top of the hill, the king's daughter was to sit, with 3 golden apples in her lap. The man who could ride up and carry off the 3 golden apples was to have half the kingdom, and the princess for a wife. This the king had posted all over his realm, and had given it out to many other kingdoms besides. The princess was so lovely that all who set eyes on her, how much more we got, fell in love with her, whether they would or no. I guess whether they would succeed or not. So I needn't tell you how all the princes and knights who heard of her were eager to win her and half the kingdom besides. They came riding from all parts of the world on high prancing horses and clad in the grandest clothes, for there wasn't one of them who hadn't made up his mind that he and he alone was to win the princess. When the day of the trial came, there was such a crowd of princes and knights under the glass hill that made one's head whirl to look at them. Everyone in the country who could crawl along was off to the hill, for they all were eager to see the man who was to win the princess. The 2 older brothers set off with the rest, but as far as Boots was concerned, they said outright that he couldn't go with them, because if they were to be seen with such a lad, folk would make game of them. Sound like Cinderella, but with boys instead of girls. Very well, said Boots. It's all one to me. I can go alone and stand or fall by myself. Now when the 2 brothers came to the hill of glass, the knights and princes were all hard at it, riding their horses till they were all in a foam. But it was no good, for as soon as ever their horses set foot on the hill, down they slipped. There wasn't one who could get a yard or 2 up, and no wonder, for the hill was as smooth as glass and as steep as a house wall. But all were eager to have the princess and half of the kingdom, so they rode and slipped and slipped and rode, and still it was the same story over again. At last all the horses were so weary that they could scarce lift a leg, so the knights had to give up trying for that day. The king was just thinking that he would proclaim a new trial for the next day to see if they would have better luck, when all at once a knight came riding up on so brave a steed that no one had ever seen the like of it before. So he got one that he'd been hiding out. Let's see. The knight had mail of brass, and the horse a brass bit in his mouth so bright that the sunbeams shone from it. Then all the others called out to him he might just as well spare himself the trouble of riding up the hill, for it would lead to no good. But he gave no heed to them, and put his horse at the hill, and went quite easily for about 1/3 of the height. And when he got so far, he turned around and rode down again. The princess thought she had never seen so lovely a knight, and while he was riding, she sat and thought to herself, "Oh, would that he might not only come up and down the other side." When she saw him turning back, she threw down one of the golden apples after him, and it rolled down into his shoe. But when he got to the bottom of the hill, he rode off so fast that no one could tell what had become of him. Sounds like Cinderella and the lost slipper, doesn't it? That evening all the knights and princes were to go before the king, that he who had ridden so far up the hill might show the apple which the princess had thrown. But there was no one who had anything to show. One after the other they all came, but not a man of them could show the apple. That evening the brothers of Boots came home too, and had such a long story to tell about the riding up the hill. First of all, they said there was not one of the whole lot who could get so much as a stride up. But at last came one knight who had such a suit made of brass mail, and a brass bridle and saddle, all so bright that the sun shone from them a mile off. He was a clap to ride. He rode a third the way up the hill of the glass, and could easily have ridden the whole way up if he chose, but he turned around and rode down, thinking maybe that was enough for once. "Oh, I should so like to have seen him, that I should," said Boots, who sat by the fireside, and it was Boots. "Oh," said his brothers, "you would you? You look fit to keep company with such high lords sitting there by the fire." The next day the brothers were all for setting off again, and Boots begged to go with them and see the riding, but no, they would not have him no matter how he begged. "Well, well," said Boots, "if I go at all, I must go by myself. I'm not afraid." When the brothers arrived at the hill of glass, all the princes and knights began to ride again, and you may fancy that they had taken care to shoe their horses sharp, but it was no good. They rode and slipped and rode just as they had done the day before. There was not one of them that could get so far as a yard up the hill. When they had worn out their horses so they could not stir, they were all forced to give it up as a bad job. The king thought he might as well proclaim that the riding should take place the day after for the last time, just to give them one more chance. But all at once it came across his mind that he might as well wait a little longer to see if the knight in the brass mail would come this day too. Well, they saw nothing of him, but suddenly came a knight riding on a steed far braver and finer than that on which the knight in brass had ridden, and he had a silver mail and silver saddle and bridle, all so bright that the sunbeams gleamed and glanced from them far away. Then the others shouted out to him, saying he might as well stop and not try to ride up the hill, for all his trouble would be in vain. But the knight paid no heed to them and rode straight at the hill and right up until he had gone 2/3 of the way. Then he wheeled his horse around and rode down again. To tell the truth, the princess liked him still better than the knight in brass, and sat and wished he might only be able to come right up to the top and down the other side. But when she saw him turning back, she threw the second apple after him, and it rolled down and fell into his shoe. But as soon as ever he had come down from the hill of glass, he rode off so fast that no one could see what became of him. At even, when all were to go before the king and princess, that he who had the golden apple might show it, in that went one after the other, but there was none who had an apple to show. And the two brothers, as they had done on the previous day, went home and told how they had gone, and how all had ridden at the hill, and none had been able to ride up. But last of all, said they, came one in a silver suit, and his horse had a silver saddle and a silver bridle. He was just the chap to ride. He got 2/3 up the hill and then turned back. He was a fine fellow and no mistake, and the princess threw down the second apple to him. "Oh," said Boots, "I should so like to have seen him too. That I should." The third day everything happened as it had happened the 2 days before. Boots begged to go and see the sight, but the brothers wouldn't hear of his going with them. When they got to the hill, there was no one who could get so much as a yard up, Now all waited for the knight in silver mail, but they neither saw nor heard of him. What's going to come in this time? Do you remember? At last came one riding on a steed so brave that no one had ever seen his match. And the knight had a suit of golden mail, and a saddle and bridle so wondrously bright that the sunbeams glanced from them a mile off. The other knights and princes could not find time to call out to him, not to try his luck, for they were amazed to see how grand he was. So he rode right up the hill, and at such speed that the princes hadn't time to wish that he might get up the entire way. As soon as he reached the top, he took the third apple from the princess's lap, then turned his horse and rode down again. As soon as he got down, he rode off at full speed and was out of sight of everyone in no time. Now when the brothers reached home at even, I guess that means evening, you may fancy what long stories they told, how the riding had gone off that day, and amongst other things they had a great deal to say about the knight in golden mail. He just is a chap to ride, they said, so grand a knight isn't to be found in the whole world. Oh, said Boots, I should so like to have seen him, that I should. Oh, said his brothers, his mail shone a great deal brighter than the glowing coals, which you are always poking and digging at. He wouldn't even look at a lad like you. Next day all the knights and princes were to pass before the king and princess, so that he who had the golden apple might bring it forth. But one came after another, first the princess, then the knights, and still no one could show the golden apple. Well, said the king, someone must have it, for it was something we all saw with our own eyes, how a knight rode up and carried it off. He commanded that everyone who was in the kingdom should come up to the palace and see if he could show the apple. Well, they all came one after another, but no one had the golden apple. And after a long time, the two brothers of Boots came. They were the last of all, so the king asked them if there was anyone else in the kingdom who hadn't come. Oh, yes, said they, we have a brother, but he never carried off the golden apples. He hasn't stirred away from home on any of the 3 days. They didn't know. Never mind that, said the king. He may as well come up to the palace like the rest. So Boots had to go up to the palace. How now, said the king, have you the golden apples? Speak out. Yes, I have, said Boots. Here is the first, and here is the second, and here's the third too. And with that he pulled the 3 golden apples out of his pocket, and at the same time threw off his sooty clothes, and there stood before them in his gleaming golden mail. Yes, said the king, you may have my daughter and half my kingdom, for you well deserve them both. So they all got ready for the wedding, and Boots married the princess, and there was much merrymaking at the bridal feast, you may fancy. And all I can say is, if they haven't left off merrymaking yet, why, they are still at it. That's the end. And the next time we will be reading The Fisherman and His Wife. Have a happy day, junior squirrels and any senior squirrels that are watching. And love to you all. And until we see each other again, be sweet. Don't be ugly. Mwah. Love you. Bye-bye.